Imagine waking up in a world that looks almost identical to the one we know today. Banks are open, ATMs still hum quietly on street corners, credit cards slide smoothly through payment terminals, and numbers move across screens at the speed of light. Salaries are deposited, loans are issued, markets rise and fall, and governments reassure their citizens that the system, while imperfect, is under control. At first glance, nothing seems broken. Life goes on. In this world, Bitcoin was never created. The financial crisis of 2008 still happened. Major banks still collapsed under the weight of their own excess. Governments still stepped in with emergency measures, bailouts, and newly printed money. Ordinary people still lost their jobs, their homes, their savings. And just like in our world, the pain eventually faded into memory. New regulations were written. A few executives were shamed. The machine restarted, but something subtle never emerged. Without Bitcoin, that crisis passed without leaving behind a radical question. People were angry, yes. Distrustful, certainly. But the anger had no alternative direction to flow into. The only question most people asked was when the system would return to normal, not whether that normal deserved to exist in the first place. In this version of history, money remains an unquestioned fact of life. It is something issued by authorities, managed by institutions, and accepted because it always has been. The idea that money itself could be redesigned from the ground up never truly enters the public imagination. Economists debate policy. Politicians argue about interest rates and debt ceilings. But the foundation stays untouched because no one ever pointed at it and said, what if it could be different? Bitcoin, in our world, did not arrive with loud speeches or political movements. It appeared quietly, as a piece of code, accompanied by a short white paper and a single embedded message referencing a bank bailout headline. It didn't protest the system directly, it simply refused to depend on it. In a world without Bitcoin, that refusal never materializes. And so the concept of trust remains centralized by default. People trust banks because they have no practical alternative. They trust governments to manage currency responsibly because history offers no working example of money existing outside state control in the digital age. Even when inflation rises, when currencies weaken, when access to funds is restricted, these events are treated as unfortunate outcomes, not structural flaws. The absence of Bitcoin does not make the system more just or more stable. It merely makes it less challenged. In this world, conversations about money stay shallow. Money is discussed as a tool for spending and saving, not as a system of power. Most people never pause to consider that inflation is not just rising prices, but a silent transfer of value. That freezing bank accounts is not merely a legal procedure, but a reminder of who ultimately controls access to wealth. That financial inclusion is not only about opening accounts, but about who gets permission to participate at all. Without Bitcoin, these ideas remain academic at best. They live in textbooks, lectures, and obscure forums, far removed from everyday life. There is no living, breathing example to point to and say, this exists, this works, this is happening right now. And because no example, imagination stays constrained. The world still believes that complex systems require central authorities, that order demands oversight, that without trusted intermediaries, chaos would reign. These beliefs are rarely tested because no alternative system ever grows large enough to force comparison. Centralization feels natural, even inevitable. People adapt, as humans always do. They find ways to survive within the rules they are given. Some learn to invest. Others learn to navigate bureaucracy. A few benefit greatly from proximity to financial power, while many remain perpetually one crisis away from instability. This inequality is visible, but it is also normalized. What never happens is the collective realization that money itself could be neutral, predictable, and not subject to the changing incentives of those who control it. Bitcoin's greatest impact was never its price, its volatility, or its headlines. It was the uncomfortable mirror it held up to the existing system. By existing at all, it asked a question that could not be unasked. Why does money work this way? Who decided this? And who benefits? In a world without Bitcoin, that mirror is missing. The system continues not because it is perfect, but because it is familiar. And familiarity, when combined with complexity, is a powerful anesthetic. It dulls curiosity. It suppresses doubt. It makes people believe that what exists is all that could ever exist. Nothing collapses dramatically in this world. There is no single moment of failure that screams for reinvention. Instead, there is a quiet absence, the absence of a challenge, the absence of a provocation, the absence of a radically simple idea that says, you don't need permission to hold value. You don't need trust in people you'll never meet. You only need rules that no one can change. And because that idea never appears, the world keeps functioning, but it does so without ever questioning the ground beneath its feet. Even in a world without Bitcoin, technology does not stand still. The internet continues to spread across the globe, smartphones become extensions of the human hand, and financial technology evolves at a breathtaking pace. Payments become faster, apps become sleeker, and transactions become nearly invisible. From the outside, it looks like progress. Convenience improves, efficiency increases, friction is reduced. But beneath the surface, something essential is missing. Without Bitcoin, innovation in finance remains trapped within familiar boundaries. Every new product, no matter how advanced, still depends on trusted intermediaries. Banks, payment processors, clearinghouses, and regulators sit quietly at the center of every transaction. Technology does not remove them, it merely wraps them in better interfaces. Fintech in this world is not about freedom, it is about optimization. Mobile banking apps make it easier to access accounts, but they do not change who controls them. Digital wallets store value, but that value can still be frozen, reversed, or denied. Cross-border payments become faster, yet they remain filtered through the same institutional gates that have always decided who gets access and who does not. Without Bitcoin, the idea of a truly trustless system never escapes academic circles. Cryptography is still used to secure data, protect communications, and verify identities, but it is never allowed to challenge the monetary order itself. The notion that math could replace institutional trust in the most sensitive domain of all, money, feels unrealistic, even dangerous. And so blockchain technology, if it appears at all, takes a very different path. Instead of open, permissionless networks, blockchains are built behind closed doors. Private ledgers emerge within corporations and governments, marketed as tools for transparency, while remaining firmly under centralized control. They improve auditing, reduce costs, and increase efficiency, but they do not redistribute power. The architecture may change, but the hierarchy stays intact. There is no decentralized finance movement, no explosion of experimentation driven by anonymous developers across the world, no radical reimagining of lending, borrowing, and value exchange outside traditional institutions. Without Bitcoin as the foundational proof that such systems can exist in the wild, the risk feels unjustifiable. And without risk, there is no leap. The absence of Bitcoin also delays a psychological breakthrough. People never experience firsthand what it feels like to hold value without permission, to send money across borders without asking a bank, a government, or a corporation to approve it, to know that no one can dilute their savings by changing a policy behind closed doors. For millions living under unstable currencies or strict capital controls, this absence is not theoretical. It is deeply personal. In countries plagued by hyperinflation, citizens continue to watch their purchasing power evaporate year after year. They search for ways to protect themselves, often turning to foreign currencies, physical assets, or informal markets. These methods are risky, limited, and often illegal. Without Bitcoin, there is no digital lifeboat, no neutral asset that exists beyond borders and politics. For those without access to banking, the situation remains largely unchanged. Financial inclusion campaigns promise progress, but inclusion still means entry into a system that can exclude you just as easily. Accounts can be closed, transfers can be blocked, identity requirements can become insurmountable barriers. Bitcoin, in our world, did not solve these problems overnight, but it introduced a new category of possibility. It proved that access to a global financial network could be granted by code, not credentials. That ownership could be verified by keys, not paperwork. Without it, that possibility remains invisible. Developers, too, feel the absence. A generation of engineers in our world was inspired not by profit, but by the elegance of a system that worked without central control. They asked new questions, built strange experiments, and pushed the boundaries of what software could govern. In a world without Bitcoin, their talent flows elsewhere. into advertising algorithms, surveillance systems, and incremental efficiency gains for existing power structures. Technology still advances, but its direction is narrower. What emerges is a world where financial life becomes smoother but not freer, faster but not fairer, more connected, yet still constrained by invisible lines of permission and authority. People sense that something is off, but they struggle to name it. After all, they can pay with a tap, send money with a swipe, and invest with a click. It feels modern, it feels advanced, and yet, at its core, it is the same system, dressed in better clothes. Financial freedom in this world is not denied forever. It is simply postponed. And sometimes, postponement is the most effective form of control. In a world where Bitcoin never existed, power over money remains firmly concentrated, not because people consciously chose it, but because no credible alternative ever forced a comparison. Central banks continue to define what money is, how much of it should exist, and who ultimately has access to it. This authority is rarely questioned at its core. It is debated, criticized, and occasionally blamed, but almost never challenged in principle. Without Bitcoin, monetary power feels like gravity, invisible, omnipresent, and seemingly unavoidable. Governments expand their influence through fiscal and monetary tools that grow more complex with each crisis. Interest rates rise and fall. Quantitative easing becomes a familiar phrase. Balance sheets swell to unimaginable sizes. These measures are presented as technical necessities, too intricate for ordinary citizens to fully understand. And because there is no competing system to compare them against, complexity itself becomes a shield. People may feel that something is wrong, but they lack a clear language to articulate it. Inflation, for example, is discussed as an unfortunate side effect of growth or emergency intervention. Few pause to see it as a structural outcome of a system that can create money at will. Without Bitcoin's fixed supply standing quietly in the background as a contrast, the idea that scarcity could be enforced by design rather than policy feels abstract, even naive. As a result, public debate remains confined to surface-level disagreements. How much inflation is acceptable? How fast should interest rates change? Who should be blamed when things go wrong? These questions generate endless noise, but they never reach the deeper issue of who should control money in the first place. The absence of Bitcoin also reshapes the nature of resistance. Historically, resistance to financial power has taken loud, visible forms. Protests, strikes, political movements, sometimes even revolutions. These expressions of dissent rely on mass coordination and public confrontation. They demand attention, and in doing so, expose participants to suppression, co-option, or exhaustion. Bitcoin introduced something different, a form of resistance that required no slogans, no leaders, and no permission. Simply opting into a parallel system, one that operated by rules rather than decrees, became an act of quiet defiance. In a world without Bitcoin, that option never appears. Dissatisfaction still exists, but it has nowhere to settle. People continue to participate in the system they distrust because there is no exit that does not involve significant personal risk. To leave the financial system entirely is impractical. To challenge it directly is dangerous or futile. So most adapt, compromise, and internalize their frustration. This quiet compliance strengthens the very structures that cause discontent. When banks impose restrictions, they are seen as unfortunate but legitimate. When accounts are frozen, it is framed as law enforcement or risk management. When capital controls are introduced, they are justified as temporary safeguards. Each measure, on its own, appears reasonable. Together, they form a dense web of control that tightens almost unnoticed. Without Bitcoin, there is no living demonstration that value can move freely without oversight. No example that proves censorship-resistant exchange is not a theoretical fantasy, but a functioning reality. As a result, the idea of financial sovereignty feels extreme, even suspicious. Those who argue for it are dismissed as unrealistic or irresponsible. Power in this world does not need to be aggressive. It is reinforced by normalcy, by the simple fact that everyone else is participating, by the absence of an alternative that forces accountability. Centralization persists not because it is universally loved, but because it is uncontested. This also affects how crises are handled. When systems fail, solutions come from the same institutions that caused the failures. New regulations are layered onto old frameworks. Oversight increases, surveillance expands. Each crisis justifies a little more control, a little less privacy, a little more dependency. And without a parallel system to absorb pressure or offer escape, these measures become permanent. Bitcoin, by existing, forced institutions to reckon with the possibility that control has limits, that people could choose to step outside. Without it, those limits remain hypothetical. Perhaps most importantly, the absence of Bitcoin weakens the imagination of future resistance. Younger generations grow up learning that money is something you access through approval, that financial identity is granted, not inherent. That participation in the global economy requires compliance with rules set far away. These assumptions shape behavior long before they are consciously examined, and when assumptions go unexamined, they become destiny. The world does not descend into tyranny overnight. Instead, it drifts toward a softer, more efficient form of control, one where resistance is rare, not because it is impossible, but because it is difficult to even envision. Power remains centralized, and without a quiet, code-based form of resistance to challenge it, most people never realize that another path could have existed. If Bitcoin had never been created, the world would not have stopped searching for stability, fairness, or meaning in its financial systems. It might have moved more slowly. It might have taken a longer, more cautious path. But the forces that gave birth to Bitcoin would not simply disappear. They would wait. Throughout history, certain ideas emerge not because someone invents them at the perfect moment, but because the moment itself demands them. Writing appeared when memory was no longer enough. Printing spread when knowledge could no longer remain confined. The internet emerged when communication outgrew physical boundaries. These were not luxuries. They were responses to pressure. Bitcoin belongs in that lineage. If Satoshi Nakamoto had never published a white paper, never mined the first block, never embedded a quiet message about a bank bailout into a digital ledger, the question would still linger in the background of human progress. Can money exist without trust in rulers? Can value be stored and transferred without permission? Can rules replace discretion in a system so deeply tied to power? Without Bitcoin, these questions remain unanswered, but not unfelt. The world described so far continues to function, but it carries a subtle tension. Crises repeat themselves. Inequality persists. Trust in institutions erodes gradually, unevenly, often invisibly. Each generation grows slightly more skeptical than the last, yet inherits the same tools to deal with that skepticism. Vote, protest, complain, adapt. Eventually, adaptation begins to feel like surrender. At some point, the gap between what people are told and what they experience becomes too wide to ignore. Money that is said to be stable no longer feels stable. Systems described as fair no longer feel fair. And narratives built on trust begin to crack under the weight of repeated exceptions, emergency measures, and temporary solutions that never quite go away. In such an environment, the absence of Bitcoin does not prevent change. It only delays it. Another idea would eventually surface. Perhaps not identical, perhaps not in the form of Bitcoin as we know it, but something that answers the same underlying need, a system that limits arbitrary control. That reduces reliance on centralized trust. That offers individuals a way to opt out, quietly, without confrontation. Because the desire behind Bitcoin is not technological, it is human. It is the desire for predictability in a world of shifting rules, for ownership that cannot be reinterpreted, for participation that does not depend on approval from distant authorities. These desires do not vanish when ignored. They accumulate, and when they finally find expression, they tend to do so with force. In this sense, Bitcoin was not an accident. It was an early answer. A rough, imperfect, but functional response to a question that had been forming for decades. By arriving when it did, it shaped the conversation, influenced an entire generation of thinkers and builders, and altered the trajectory of technological and financial development. Without it, the world would have remained calmer on the surface. There would have been fewer headlines, fewer controversies, fewer dramatic rises and crashes to argue about. Life might have felt more stable, more predictable, more familiar. But beneath that stability would lie a growing fragility, a system untested by true alternatives. A structure never forced to justify its own assumptions. Bitcoin's true legacy is not that it promised a perfect future. It is that it made the present harder to ignore. By existing, it reminded the world that money is not a law of nature. It is a design choice, and design choices can be questioned. In a world without Bitcoin, that reminder is missing. Progress continues, but along safer paths. Innovation happens, but within approved boundaries. Power adapts, but rarely relinquishes. Eventually, history would circle back to the same crossroads. Someone, somewhere, would ask the forbidden question again. Not because they wanted to disrupt the world, but because the world had made disruption unavoidable. When that happens, the idea would emerge once more, under a different name, in a different form, shaped by a different era. Because ideas rooted in fundamental human needs do not die, they wait. And Bitcoin, whether created when it was or not, represents one of those ideas.